Temujin rode back to the Olkono tribe, no longer a frightened boy, but a young man with a chest full of resolve. He had promised Porthe he would return, and the steppe did not forgive broken vows. When they met, she looked at him not with the eyes of a stranger, but with the recognition of a shared destiny. They were married quickly, the ceremony simple but binding, tying their souls together under the vast sky. For a brief moment, there was peace. They pitched their yurt on the banks of the Sengu River. The black coat of the sable goat both brought as a dowry, resting in the corner like a sleeping beast. It was a time of quiet joy, but Temujin kept his sword close. He knew the silence of the steppe was often the breath before the scream, and happiness was a thief that stole vigilance when you needed it the most. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder of the harsh world waiting to test them. The attack came in the dead of night, shattering the silence with the thunder of hooves and the guttural screams of the merkids. They had come for revenge, seeking to settle an old debt from the time of Temujin's father, a ghost returning to haunt the living. Temujin woke to the sound of tearing felt and chaos. He scrambled for a horse, the instinct to survive overriding all else. "Run!" he shouted, scattering his family into the darkness of the Bokan Khaldun. But in the confusion, the merkids found the ox cart. They found Porthe. As Temujin spurred his horse up the steep cliffs, heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum, he looked back to see his wife being dragged away into the night, her face pale in the moonlight, a prize for his enemies. The agony of that sight would fuel a fire that would burn the world. He swore to the sky that he would not rest until she was returned. The sun rose over a desolate camp. The merkids were gone, leaving only tracks and ashes. Temujin stood in the center of the empty yurt, the silence pressing in on him like a physical weight, heavier than any armor. He had survived, but the cost was unbearable. He had saved his own life while his wife was taken, a shame that burned hotter than fire in his belly. He fell to his knees, clutching the earth, pleading with the eternal blue sky. But his prayer was not for comfort, it was for power. He realized then that survival was not enough. To protect what he loved, he needed to be more than a man. He needed to be a force that no tribe dared to touch. The boy died into the dust of that empty yurt. The warlord was born in the ashes. He would build an iron wall around his heart. Despair turned to action. Temujin knew he could not fight the merkids alone. He needed an army. He remembered the sable coat, Porthe's dowry, the most valuable thing he possessed. He rode to the camp of Togrul Khan, the leader of the Kiraids, and his father's old blood brother. It was a gamble. He entered the great Khan's tent, bowing low, and presented the coat. "I have no father," Temujin said, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. "So I come to you." Togrul looked at the young man, saw the steel in his eyes and accepted the gift. He pledged his warriors to Temujin's cause. It was the first step in a dance of politics that would one day consume them all, binding their fates in blood. The court was the price of an empire. With Togrul's support secured, Temujin reached out to the only other man he trusted, Jamuka, his blood brother from childhood. They met on the open steppe, their horses touching noses. Jamuka had grown into a charismatic leader, his hair braided with gold, his eyes bright with ambition. He did not hesitate. They have stolen part of your heart, Jamuka said, so we shall tear out theirs. The two armies united, a sea of banners fluttering in the wind. Kiraids, Mongols, and Jadran rode together. It was the largest force Temujin had ever seen, and he rode at the front, shoulder to shoulder with his Anda, united by a single bloody purpose. The ground shook beneath thousands of hooves, a warning to the Merkits that death was coming. The alliance was forged in the fire of shared vengeance. They struck the Merkit camp by moonlight, descending like a landslide. The surprise was total. Temujin did not fight for plunder. He fought for Borte. He rode through the chaos, screaming her name, cutting down anyone who stood in his path. The Merkits scrambled in panic, fleeing into the night. Amidst the screaming and the clash of steel, a woman ran from a cart, grabbing the reins of his horse. It was Borte. She wept, clinging to his leg. Temujin pulled her up onto his saddle, holding her close, feeling the warmth of her life against his armor. The victory was absolute. The Merkits were scattered, and Temujin had reclaimed his honor. He looked at Jamuka across the field of victory, unaware that this triumph was the beginning of their end. The moon watched silently as the seeds of rivalry were sown. The ride home was a procession of glory. They had defeated a powerful enemy and recovered the stolen bride. The tribes camped together in the Kororkyuk Valley, a sprawling city of yurts and fires. Temujin and Jamuka were inseparable, sleeping under the same blanket as they had when they were boys. We represent the new steppe, Jamuka declared, dreaming of a restored Mongol aristocracy. Temujin listened, but his thoughts were different. He saw the common warriors, the men who had fought with nothing but loyalty, not for lineage, but for a leader who led from the front. He began to see a world where nobility was earned by the sword, not by birth. The two suns of the steppe were shining together, but the sky was only big enough for one. The cracks in their brotherhood were small but deep. For a year and a half, they lived as one camp, but the tension grew like a weed in the grass. Jamuka was a noble, believing in the divine right of the white-boned lineage. Temujin was a pragmatist, promoting men based on skill. One day, as they rode at the front of the caravan, Jamuka stopped. He spoke a riddle. Let us camp near the mountain for the shepherds, or near the river for the horse herders. It was a test, a cryptic message that told Temujin they had different priorities. Jamuka wanted to assert his dominance, to make Temujin follow his lead. Temujin looked at his brother and realized the time of shared blankets was over. They were no longer boys playing on the ice. They were rivals for the soul of the people. The words hung in the air, sharp and dividing. Temujin consulted Porte, whose wisdom cut through the confusion like a knife. "He is tired of us," she said. "We must leave him." That very night, without a word to Jamuka, Temujin ordered his people to move. They packed in silence, the air thick with the weight of the betrayal. They broke away from the main column, turning their horses into the dark, a silent exodus under the watching stars. It was the great separation. Temujin did not look back at Jamuka's fires fading in the distance. He was choosing his own path, declaring his independence with every beat of his horse's hooves. He knew this act would turn his blood brother into his fiercest enemy, but a wolf cannot run in another wolf's shadow forever. The die was cast, and the steppe would bleed for it. The silence of the night felt heavy, pregnant with the violence to come. As dawn broke, Temujin looked back. He expected to see only his own small family. Instead, he saw a long line of dust on the horizon. Many of Jamuka's men, and even men from other clans, had followed him. They were the lower classes, the outcasts, the men who saw in Temujin a leader who valued their strength over their pedigree. They came to him not because they had to, but because they chose to. "We will drive your sheep and guard your horses," they pledged, their voices rough with honesty. Temujin realized he was no longer just a clan leader. He was becoming a magnet for the dispossessed. He had stolen Jamuka's strength without drawing a sword, and the weight of that trust settled heavy on his shoulders. He was their hope, and they were his power. The sun shone on a new army, ragtag but fiercely loyal. The gathered followers held a council on the banks of the river. They did not wait for the permission of the elders or the distant Jin emperors. They lifted Temujin onto a white felt rug, the symbol of royalty. They declared him Khan, Khan of the Mongols. It was a title that had lain dormant for generations, a ghost from the past now resurrected. "If we disobey you in war," they swore, "take away our wives and cattle, and cast our heads on the ground." Temujin accepted the weight of the title. He appointed generals not from his family, but from his most loyal followers. Subutai, the blacksmith's son; Jebe, the archer. The meritocracy had begun, and the old world was about to break under the strain of this new idea. The old gods watched as a new king was crowned, and the eagles screamed their approval. News of the election reached Jamuka, and his rage was a cold, terrifying thing. He felt betrayed by the brother he had helped raise from the dust. He saw Temujin's meritocracy aristocracy as a personal insult and a threat to the sacred order of the steppe. He has stolen my men, Jamuka hissed, and now he steals the title of Khan. The love between them curdled into a hate that only brothers can feel, sharp as obsidian. Jamuka began to gather a coalition of tribes, everyone who feared the rising power of this upstart. The steppe was polarizing rapidly. Every man had to choose the old aristocracy of Jamuka or the new order of Temujin. War was inevitable, and it would be brother against brother. The drums of war began to beat, echoing off the mountains. The storm broke at Dalanbalsut. Jamuka marched with 30,000 men, a massive force determined to crush the rebellion before it could grow. Temujin, outnumbered, rode out to meet him. It was the Battle of the 13 Sides. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, a swirling melee of arrows and sabers in the narrow valleys. Temujin fought with the desperation of a man protecting a dream, striking down enemies until his arm was numb. But Jamuka was a brilliant tactician. He outmaneuvered Temujin, cutting off his flanks, driving him back into the gorges. Temujin watched his new army bleed into the grass. He realized with a sinking heart that courage alone was not enough against superior numbers and experience. He tasted the bitter ash of defeat, a taste he would never forget. The sky wept rain upon the dead. Jamuka's victory was decisive, but his aftermath was horrific. To punish the rebels and send a message to the steppe, he gathered the princes of the Chinos clan who had sided with Temujin. In a display of cruelty that shocked even the hardened nomads, he boiled 70 of them alive in great cauldrons. The screams echoed for miles, and the smell of the atrocity drifted on the wind, turning stomachs and hearts. Jamuka thought this would inspire fear and obedience. Instead, it planted the seeds of his downfall. The steppe respected strength, but it despised unnecessary cruelty. Even his own allies looked at him with wary eyes, wondering if they would be the next to feed the fires of his rage. The spirits of the boiled men cried out for justice. Temujin retreated, his forces shattered. He fled into the deep mountains, hiding in the dark gorges of the Baljuna. His army was reduced to a handful of men, a wretched group of survivors. They had no food, no water, and their horses were dying of thirst. This was the Nadir, the lowest point of his life since the wooden collar. The winter wind mocked them, cutting through their thin rags. Most men would have surrendered or died of despair. But Temujin sat by the dying fire, his face grim. He did not mourn the defeat, he analyzed it. He learned that he needed better discipline, better intelligence, and absolute loyalty. He was forging a weapon in the fire of failure, creating fighting a doctrine that would never lose again. Suffering was his teacher, and he was an attentive student. For years, they lived in the shadows, fighting small skirmishes, stealing horses, surviving on the edge of the world. These were the dark years, absent from many songs, but crucial to the man he became. Temujin honed his philosophy. He banned the looting of enemies until the battle was completely won. He established the rule that shares of war booty would be given to widows and orphans of fallen soldiers. He was building a state within an army, a brotherhood where every man valued the life of the man next to him. He was no longer fighting for himself. He was fighting for a system, and slowly word spread. The man who treated his soldiers like brothers was still alive, and he was remembering every name, waiting for the moment to return. Legend grew in the silence, whispering his name. It culminated at the muddy shores of Lake Baljuna, surrounded by enemies, starving and thirsty. Temujin and his 19 remaining commanders stood by the murky water. They killed a wild horse and drank the muddy water, swearing an oath. If I drink the muddy water, may you drink it too. If I eat the gold, may you eat it too. It was a covenant of absolute equality and brotherhood, transcending tribe and race. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and shamanists stood together, united by the shared taste of grit and survival. This was the core, the unbreakable seed of the Mongol Empire. They were no longer a tribe, they were a nation of chosen brothers, bound by something stronger than blood. Fate was sealed in that mud, unbreakable and eternal. The tide began to turn. The horror of Jamukha's boiling cauldrons and the legend of Temujin's fairness caused a shift in the wind. Men began to defect from Jamukha in droves. They came to Baljuna not for gold, but for dignity. Temujin rebuilt his army, organizing them into decimals, units of 10, 100, 1,000, mixing the tribes to break old loyalties that had divided them for centuries. He created a unified force that moved with a single mind, a hive of lethal purpose. He was ready to leave the shadows. He rode out of the Baljuna wilderness not as a fugitive, but as an avenging storm, ready to settle the score with the old world once and for all. The mountains echoed with their return, shaking the earth. His first target was the Tatars, the ancient enemies who had poisoned his father. This was not a raid, it was an extermination. Temujin issued a chilling order. Fight until the end. Conquer them. The battle was fierce, but the new discipline of the Mongol army held. They crushed the Tatar lines with mechanical precision. After the victory, the council gathered to decide the fate of the Tatars. The memory of Yasugai's death and generations of betrayal weighed heavy on their hearts. They decreed the punishment of the linchpin. The Tatars effectively ceased to exist as a political force, their name wiped from the roster of the living tribes forever, a warning to all who stood against the Mongols. The debt was paid in full, written in the ledger of history. The order was carried out with cold efficiency. Every Tata male was measured against the heavy wooden linchpin of a cartwheel. Anyone taller than the linchpin, which meant every adult man and older boy, was executed. It was a massacre, brutal and systematic, a culling of the bloodline. Temujin watched, his face impassive. He was ending the cycle of vengeance by destroying the enemy entirely. He spared the small children, adopting them into Mongol families to be raised as his own. It was a terrifying logic. Kill the past, adopt the future. The steppe trembled at the calculated violence. This was not just war, it was a restructuring of the world order, written in blood. A new law was rising from the slaughter. With the Tatars gone, the balance of power shifted. Togrul Khan, the old ally, grew jealous and fearful of Temujin's rising star. Manipulated by Jamukha, Togrul plotted to assassinate Temujin under the guise of a betrothal feast. But the warning came from two herdsmen who overheard the plot. Temujin escaped the trap, but his heart was hardened into stone. The father figure he had served had betrayed him. The loyalty of the past was dead. There could be no more alliances, no more senior Khans. There was only the choice, submission or destruction. The war against the Karaites began, a war of father against son, driven by paranoia and power. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford in this dying world. Temujin did not wait to be attacked. He launched a daring night raid on the Karaite camp. He ordered his men to light huge numbers of extra fires, making his army appear twice as large in the darkness. The Karaites were panicked, confused by the deception, believing they were surrounded by a horde of demons. The battle raged for 3 days, a grinder of flesh and steel that turned the grass red. But Togrul's forces, demoralized and divided, eventually crumbled. Togrul fled into the wild, where he was ironically killed by a Naiman guard who didn't recognize him. The Karaites were absorbed. Temujin now controlled the central steppe, and the path to total dominance was open. The fires of his deception had burned away his last rival. Only one power remained, the Naimans in the west. They were a sophisticated, wealthy tribe, confident in their superiority. Their leader, Tayang Khan, mocked the Mongols as smelly barbarians. Jamukha, having fled to the Naimans, urged them to attack. The final showdown was set. Temujin marched his army west, across the vast emptiness. He prepared them not just for a battle, but for a judgment. He drilled them in silence, in complex maneuvers. He was bringing the discipline of the hunt to the chaos of war. The Naimans gathered a massive host, waiting at the foot of Mount Naku. Unaware, They were facing a new kind of warfare that would sweep them away. The sun set red on the eve of destruction, painting the sky with the color of the blood to come. The Battle of Juggernaut was the climax of decades of war. Temujin unleashed his dogs of war, the four great generals, Subutai, Jebe, Kublai, and Jelma. They hit the Naiman lines like a hammer. The Mongols used the retreating strategy, feigning panic to draw the Naimans out, then turning to encircle them in a ring of death. Jamukha, watching from the rear, saw the precision of Temujin's army and knew the end had come. He abandoned the Naimans, fleeing before the battle ended. The Naimans were crushed against the mountain. As night fell, the last resistance died. Temujin stood as the undisputed master of the Mongolian plateau, the architect of a new world. Silence fell over the battlefield, heavy and absolute, broken only by the wind. Jamukha became a fugitive, hunted and alone, hiding in the forests like a wild animal. Finally, his own 5 companions, desperate and hungry, captured him. They brought him to Temujin, expecting a reward for their treachery. Temujin looked at the men who had betrayed their lord with eyes of ice. A man who betrays his rightful Khan cannot be trusted, he declared. He ordered the 5 men executed immediately, their heads rolling in the dust. Then he turned to Jamukha. They stood face to face, the 2 suns that had scorched the earth. There was no hatred left, only a deep, tragic sadness. The long war between the blood brothers was over, ending not in fury, but in silence. Temujin offered Jamukha forgiveness. Let us be companions again, he pleaded. Let us share the blanket. But Jamukha smiled, a sad, knowing smile. He knew there was no place for him in Temujin's new world. There is only one sun in the sky, Jamukha said. If I live, I will only be a louse in your collar, a thorn in your coat. I will disturb your dreams. He asked for the final mercy. Let me die without shedding blood, and I will protect your descendants forever. He chose death to cement Temujin's rule. It was his final gift to his Anda, the ultimate sacrifice of friendship. He walked to his fate with his head held high, a prince of the steppe to the last. Temujin granted the wish. Jamukha was wrapped in a heavy felt blanket. His back was broken, a death reserved for nobility, ensuring his blood did not spill upon the earth, and his spirit remained intact. Temujin buried him with the golden sash they had exchanged as boys. He wept for the friend he had loved, the enemy he had fought, and the brother who had to die so the empire could live. It was the price of unity. The personal cost of the crown was heartbreak, a weight Temujin would carry forever, etched into the lines of his face. As he turned away from the grave, the steppe wind sang a mournful mournful song, a dirge for the brother who was lost. In the year of the tiger, 1206, a great Kurultai was summoned at the source of the Onan River. All the banners of the steppe gathered, white, black, and blue. Millions of horses grazed on the plains. The shamans beat their drums, the smoke of the fires rising to the eternal blue sky. They lifted Temujin onto the white felt rug once more, but this time it was not a small faction, it was a nation. He had united the people of the felt walls. The prophecy of the blood clot had come to pass. The outcast had become the center of the world, and the world held its breath. The spirits of his ancestors watched from the clouds, nodding in approval. The chief shaman proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler, the universal king. Temujin looked out over the sea of faces, the people he had forged into a single weapon. He thought of his father, Yasukai, of the abandoned winters, of the muddy water of Baljuna. He had mastered the steppe, but as he looked at the horizon, where the grass met the sky, his eyes narrowed. The unification was not the end, it was the beginning. Beyond the steppe lay the world, the gold of Jinn, the cities of the Muslims, the unknown West. The wolf had eaten the steppe. Now he was hungry for the world, and the age of the Mongols had begun. The would tremble before them, and history would never be the same.